Hello, Dan Alasso here, and this is Chapter 5, the fifth week of U.S. History 1. And this one is once again about colonial North America, and this time mostly from the end of the 17th to about the middle of the 18th centuries. And so, to begin, I'll backtrack just a little bit. When King Charles II ascended the restored English throne in 1660, his subjects on both sides of the Atlantic celebrated the restoration of the English monarchy after a decade of living without a king during Cromwell's dictatorial Commonwealth that followed the English Civil War. Charles II lost little time in strengthening England's global power. From the 1660s into the 1680s, England added to its North American portfolio by establishing the Restoration colonies of New York and New Jersey, taken from the Dutch, as well as Pennsylvania and Carolina, the second of which was named after his father, Charles I. In order to reap the greatest economic benefit from England's overseas possessions, Charles expanded on the mercantilist navigation acts that had actually been begun by Cromwell. And these required commerce to be conducted using only British ships. And they controlled where and in what products the colonies could trade. Although many colonial merchants kind of ignored these laws, and enforcement remained lax throughout most of this period. And it's important to note that all of the Restoration colonies started as proprietary colonies through grants that the king gave to a trusted individual or a family or a group of proprietors, and not as joint stock companies, as some of the prior ones, like the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Virginia Colony, had done. Charles hoped to establish English control over the region between Virginia and Spanish Florida. So in 1663, he issued a royal charter to 8 loyal supporters, each of whom was to be a feudal-style proprietor of this new province of Carolina. These proprietors did not actually relocate to the colonies, however. None of them did. Instead, English plantation owners from the well-established English sugar colony of Barbados migrated to the southern part of Carolina to settle there. In 1670, they established Charlestown, later Charleston, at this time named in honor of Charles II, at the junction of the Ashley and the Cooper Rivers. As the settlement around Charlestown grew into the largest port in the South, farmers mostly raised livestock to export to the West Indies and began cultivating rice, taking advantage of the fact that their enslaved workers, especially women from Africa, had been familiar with the crop back at home. In the northern pine forests, settlers, many of them from Virginia, turned sap into turpentine and pitch and tar, used to waterproof wooden sailing ships. Political discord between settlers in the northern and southern parts of Carolina escalated in the 1710s and through the 1720s and led to the creation in 1729 of 2 colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. North Carolina continued to produce items for ships, and its population increased as more Virginians moved there to expand their tobacco plantations. Tobacco became the primary export of both Virginia and of North Carolina, which also traded in deerskins and began trading in slaves from Africa. And slavery developed quickly in the Carolinas, largely because so many of the early migrants came from Barbados, where slavery was a well-established practice. By the end of the 1600s, a very wealthy class of rice planters attained dominance in the southern part of the Carolinas, especially around Charlestown. By 1715, a majority of the South Carolina population were enslaved Africans. The legal basis for slavery had been established in the early 1700s as the Carolinas began to pass slave laws based on both the Barbados slave codes of the late 1600s and those of Virginia to their north, which, you may recall, had also been developed after Bacon's Rebellion. And these laws combined all reduced African people to the status of property, to be bought and sold, just like other commodities. As in other areas of English settlement, native peoples in the Carolinas, of course, suffered tremendously from the continued introduction of more and more European diseases. As you'll remember, the southeastern region of North America had already been largely depopulated by disease between the visits of De Soto around 1540 and La Salle in the 1680s. But the surviving natives were still susceptible to all of the bacteria and viruses that Europeans carried. But despite all of these diseases, Indians in the area endured, and following the pattern that we've seen elsewhere in the colonies, began to become more dependent on European goods. Local Yamasee and Creek tribes built up a trade deficit with the English, exchanging deer skins and even captives for European guns. And English settlers exacerbated tensions with local tribes by continuing to expand their rice and tobacco fields into native lands. Worse, English traders frequently took native women captive as payment for debts. The outrages committed by traders, combined with the seemingly unstoppable expansion of English settlement onto native land, led to the outbreak of the Yamasee War from 1715 to 1718, which was an effort by a coalition of local tribes to drive out the European invaders, just as King Philip's War had a generation and a half earlier. The native effort to force the newcomers out of their ancestral lands nearly succeeded in annihilating the Carolina colonies. Only when the Cherokee decided to ally themselves with the English did the native coalition's hope of eliminating the English from the region finally disappear. So the Yamasee War kind of reminds us that English success involved being able to take advantage of disunity between different native groups. But after the end of this war, the English were even freer to expand. And some of that expansion was facilitated by Elizabeth Lucas Pinckney, who lived from 1722 to 1793. Eliza, as she was known, was born in Antigua in the Caribbean, but by the age of 16 had moved with her family to South Carolina and had been placed in charge of a 600-acre plantation and 20 enslaved workers. When her father was then recalled back to the Caribbean a year later, Eliza took over the management of several more properties, totaling over 4,500 acres. And on one of these, Eliza began experimenting with growing indigo, a blue dye plant, after her father sent her some seeds from Antigua in 1740. After perfecting, growing, and processing this dye, Eliza began selling seed to other planters in 1744, when she was still only 22. Exports of indigo rose from 5,000 pounds in 1745 and 6 to 130,000 pounds by 1748. And before the American Revolution, indigo accounted for a third of the value of all American exports. When she was 21, Eliza married Colonel Charles Pinckney, who lived from 1699 to 1758, who was also a lawyer and who also owned a neighboring plantation. And they had 4 children, and 2 of their sons would become important in the Revolutionary era. And her husband, Pinckney, became Chief Justice of the South Carolina Colonial Supreme Court, while Eliza continued to carry on her businesses. They became such a prominent family that when Eliza died of cancer in 1793 in Philadelphia, George Washington served as one of her pallbearers while Washington was president. And now to return to something again up north that we also began talking about last chapter, the English takeover of New Netherland had originated in commercial and imperial rivalry between the Dutch and the English in the Atlantic world. During the Second Anglo-Dutch War, from 1664 to 1667, English forces had occupied the Dutch fur trading colony of New Netherland, and in 1664, Charles gave this colony, including present-day New Jersey, to his brother James, the Duke of York, later King James II. The colony and the city were renamed New York in his honor, but otherwise things didn't really change that much, and this is the point I want to emphasize today. The Dutch businessmen in Manhattan didn't all get thrown out of the colony, and the Dutch patroons, the feudal landholders up the Hudson River, also didn't really lose their status. But although they were allowed to retain their feudal estates and carry on their lives as if there had been no change in government, the Dutch on Manhattan Island and in the Hudson River Valley resented English rule, and in 1673, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, they briefly recaptured the colony. However, that war ended quickly, and by the end of the conflict in 1674, the English had regained permanent control. The Duke of York, of course, had no desire to govern locally, or really to consider the wishes of local colonists, so it wasn't until 1683, almost 20 years after the English took control of the colony, that colonists were able to convene a local representative legislature. The Assembly enacted a Charter of Liberties and Privileges in 1683 that affirmed the traditional rights of Englishmen, like the right to trial by jury and the right to representative government. But still, New York society continued the Dutch patroonship system, granting large estates to a few favored families. And the largest of these new estates, measuring 250 square miles, was given to a British aristocrat named Robert Livingston in 1686. The Livingstons and the other landed families who came in to the Hudson River Valley married into Dutch patroon society and continued and even strengthened the powerful political and economic force of these elites. 18th century New York City, meanwhile, contained a variety of people and religions, including Dutch and English people, French Protestants, the Huguenots, Jews, Puritans, Quakers, Anglicans, and a large and growing population of enslaved Africans. And as they did in other regions, native peoples and slaves played important parts in the shaping of the history of colonial New York. After decades of war in the 1600s, the powerful Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, which were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, jointly adopted a policy of neutrality with both the English and the French to the north during the first half of the 1700s, after the Huron diplomat Candiaronk had brought them all together and concluded the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. And among the effects of this native diplomacy was that the New York tribes got to continue living in their own villages under their own tribal governments while continuing to enjoy the benefits of trade with now both the English and the French. And slavery was also important in the economies of the mid-Atlantic states. While New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania never really developed plantation economies, enslaved people were often used on larger farms growing cereal grains. Enslaved Africans worked alongside European tenant farmers on New York's Hudson Valley patroon ships, and in New York City at places like the port. And in fact, New York City's economy was so reliant on slavery that by 1700, over 40%, or nearly half of the total population, were enslaved people, while only 15 to 20% of Pennsylvania's colonial population included slaves by 1750, 50 years later. But in New York City, the high density of enslaved people fueled fear of rebellion. A 1712 slave revolt in New York City had resulted in the deaths of 9 white colonists. In retribution, 21 enslaved people had been executed, and 6 others had died of suicide before they could be burned alive. And you'll remember the Restoration colonies also included Pennsylvania, which very quickly became the geographic center of British colonial America. Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods in Latin, had been created in 1681 when King Charles II had bestowed the largest proprietary colony in the Americas on William Penn to settle a very big political and financial debt that he owed to the Penn family. And like many settlers in the New England colonies, many of Pennsylvania's first colonists had migrated for religious reasons. William Penn himself was a Quaker, a member of a relatively new Protestant denomination that rejected the idea of worldly rank, believing instead in a new and radical form of social equality. Their speech actually reflected this belief, and they addressed everybody as equals, using thee and thou rather than honorific terms like your lordship or my lady that had been customary for members of the hereditary elite. But their rejection of inherited rank, however, did not prevent the Quakers from seeking wealth or political power. The English establishment had persecuted Quakers in England, and colonial governments, such as Massachusetts Bay, had even executed early Quakers who had gone to proselytize there. To avoid such persecution, Quakers flocked to Pennsylvania, as well as to New Jersey, where they could preach and practice their religion in peace. Unlike New England, whose established religion was Puritanism, later known as Congregationalism, Pennsylvania didn't establish an official church. The colony allowed a degree of religious freedom that was rare in English America. And to help encourage immigration to his colony, Penn had promised a 50-acre headright or land grant to people who emigrated to Pennsylvania as indentured servants and completed their term of service. People seeking a better life came in large numbers, especially since indenture had been effectively phased out in the South. So as a result, Pennsylvania relied on indentured servants more than any other colony in this era, and many people considered it a poor man's paradise. One of the main teachings of the Quakers is pacifism, which led William Penn to make a treaty of friendship with the Lenape, or the Delaware tribe, and then another with the Susquehannocks in 1701 to avoid fighting over land. Unlike other colonies, Pennsylvania did not experience war on the frontier with native people during its early history. And as an important port city, Philadelphia grew rapidly. Despite their pacifism and their egalitarian forms of speaking, Quaker merchants were astute businessmen with contacts throughout the Atlantic world, who did participate in the African slave trade. Some Quakers, however, began to become troubled by the contradiction between their beliefs and slavery. Gradually, they rejected the trade and ultimately began to advocate for abolishing slavery entirely. This would lead in 1775 to the formation of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Philadelphia also acted as a magnet for immigrants who came not only from England, but from all over Europe, by the hundreds of thousands. The city and Pennsylvania generally appeared to offer the best opportunity for poor men and women, many of whom arrived as indentured servants, but all of whom dreamed of owning land and having a better life. Some, like Benjamin Franklin, a runaway from Puritan Boston, did extraordinarily well. Other immigrant groups in the colony, most notably Germans and Scotch-Irish, greatly improved their lot in Pennsylvania. Of course, enslaved Africans imported into the colony to work for white masters were certainly not as fortunate. The colony's goal of creating wealth for the empire remained the primary focus. And in the second half of the 17th century, England attempted to gain better control of trade with its American colonies. The mercantilist policies that the crown used to achieve this control were the Navigation Acts. The 1651 Navigation Ordinance, which, as I said, was first passed by Cromwell's Commonwealth, required that only English ships could carry goods between England and its colonies. The ordinance also listed enumerated articles that could be transported only to England or to English colonies, including lucrative commodities like sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, molasses, and those naval stores such as turpentine. These were all valuable goods, and they were all goods that were not produced back home in England, that were in demand by English consumers and by the English Navy. After reclaiming the throne, Charles II's government passed a 1660 Navigation Act, which reinstated the 1651 Ordinance to ensure a monopoly on imports from the colonies. Other navigation acts included the 1663 Staple Act and the 1673 Plantation Duties Act. The Staple Act barred the colonists from importing manufactured goods that had not been made in England, and that created a profitable monopoly for English manufacturers and exporters. The Plantation Duties Act taxed goods exported from one colony directly to another. This was a measure that was aimed principally at New Englanders who exported food to the Caribbean sugar islands and, on the way back, imported great quantities of molasses to make rum. New England distillers also smuggled molasses that they bought cheaply from French-held islands that were not allowed to distill their own spirits due to French laws that protected France's wine industry. But despite those new navigation acts, Great Britain continued to exercise relatively lax control over the English colonies during most of the 18th century. King James II, the second son of Charles I, ascended to the English throne in 1685 after the death of his brother Charles II. James had spent the decade of his exile during Cromwell's reign in France, and he modeled his rule on that of the Sun King, his cousin, the French Catholic King Louis XIV. James centralized English power around the throne, emulating the absolute monarchy that his cousin enjoyed. Also, like Louis XIV, James II was a Catholic, which frightened the Anglican bishops in the House of Lords. And, remembering the Civil War, James held on to his standing army. And this made English Protestants afraid that it would be used to crush their liberty. As James's strength grew, his opponents suspected that their king might try to turn England into a Catholic monarchy, in which he would have absolute power over the people. And in 1686, the king applied this concept of a centralized state to the colonies by creating the Dominion of New England. The Dominion, which I've mentioned before, included all the New England colonies: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, and Rhode Island. And in 1688 was enlarged by the addition of New York and New Jersey. And the man James put in charge of this, Sir Edmund Andros, former colonial governor of New York, was personally loyal to the king and his family. Andros had very little sympathy for the New Englanders, and in addition to alarming New England Puritans when he tried to impose the Church of England on them, and landowners when he challenged land titles that didn't acknowledge the king, Andros also committed himself to strictly enforcing the Navigation Acts, a move that threatened to disrupt the region's trade, which was largely based on practices that the Acts had begun to define as smuggling. In England, opponents of James II's effort to create a centralized Catholic absolute monarchy were known as Whigs. The Whigs worked tirelessly but carefully to depose James without triggering another civil war and another regicide. And in late 1688, they succeeded in an event that they celebrated as the Glorious Revolution. James reluctantly abdicated and fled back to the court of Louis XIV in France, while his daughter Mary and her husband William, who was the Prince of Orange and the elected ruler of the Protestant Dutch Republic, ascended the throne together in 1689. The Glorious Revolution spilled over into the colonies. In 1689, hearing news of what was happening back home, Bostonians overthrew the Dominion of New England, and they jailed Sir Edmund Andros and other leaders of the regime. In New York, a German-born fur trader named Jacob Leisler led a group of Protestant New Yorkers against the Dominion government. Acting on his own authority, Leisler assumed the role of King William's governor and organized intercolonial military actions, independent of English authority. And when the new government in London heard about this, despite the fact that he had been on their side, they decided Leisler's actions had usurped the crown's prerogative, and as a result of going a bit too far, he was tried for treason and executed. But on the plus side, in 1691, England restored control to individual governors for the colonies, and to some extent to the colonial legislatures. Now, the Glorious Revolution led to the establishment of an English nation that limited the power of the king and provided new protections for English subjects. England's 1689 Bill of Rights established a constitutional monarchy, making Parliament independent from the monarch, and protected rights such as freedom of speech, regular elections, and the right to petition the king. It guaranteed these rights to all English subjects, including residents of the colonies. And it also included the right to trial by jury and habeas corpus. And that's the requirement for the authorities to bring an imprisoned person before a court to demonstrate the cause of their imprisonment. John Locke, who was a doctor and an educator who had actually taken refuge in Holland during the reign of James II, and had returned to England after the Glorious Revolution, published 2 treatises on government in 1690. Locke argued that government was a social contract between the leaders and the people, and that representative government existed to protect life, liberty, and property. Locke rejected the divine right of kings and instead advocated for the role of Parliament in a limited monarchy. Locke's political philosophy had an enormous impact on future generations of colonists and established the paramount importance of representation in government. And historians have celebrated Locke as a leading figure in the humanist developments that we call the Enlightenment. And actually, they've often ignored or excused Locke's support of both slavery and a strict separation of society into an almost feudal arrangement of wealthy proprietors and dependent tenants, which he had described in the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina 2 decades earlier. Although the ideas about individual rights and a social contract that are central to the Enlightenment were clearly developed and described by European philosophers such as John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, and Voltaire, whose real name was François-Marie Arouet, who lived from 1694 to 1778, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, and Nicolas de Condorcet, who was slightly younger, 1743 to 1794. These philosophers and authors were all central. But recently, philosophers have suggested that some of the ideas that these philosophers championed may already have existed in the Americas. And even, perhaps, that some of these American ideas had influenced their thinking as they developed these ideals that were later expressed in documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen during the French Revolution. For example, Louis Armand, the Baron de la Hontan, who lived from 1666 to 1716, had been a somewhat impoverished minor French aristocrat who traveled extensively as a young man in the Great Lakes regions that are now Canada and Wisconsin and Minnesota. He wrote a 3-volume memoir of his travels. The second of these volumes contains his recollections of a long conversation that La Hontan had with that Huron diplomat named Candiaronk. The Huron, whom La Hontan called Adario in the dialogue, was chief of the Hurons living around Fort Michilimackinac and had led them in wars against the Iroquois for years before finally brokering that great peace of Montreal in 1701. Kandiaronk was famous as an orator and was often invited to dine with the French Governor General, Frontenac, because he was said to be the best conversationalist in all America. A Jesuit historian, Charlevoix, said no Indian he had met, in his words, ever possessed greater merit, a finer mind, more valor, prudence, or discernment in understanding those with whom he had to deal. Part of Kandiaronk's understanding of the French had come from over a decade of close study that had included a visit to France, he claimed. And he criticized the French for their acceptance of the arbitrary authority of a king and what he considered their general obsequiousness. Kandiaronk argued that the love of money and property had poisoned the European mind, and he observed that the worst insult that one could possibly give to a Huron would be to try to tell him what to do. Many of the ideas that Kandiaronk introduced into this conversation that La Hontan recorded became central to the Enlightenment worldview. And it's been well documented that philosophers such as Leibniz were familiar with La Hontan's writing. It's well known that La Hontan and Leibniz carried on a long-term correspondence. So it seems reasonable to imagine that the concepts of liberty and consensus governing that people such as the Huron lived by may have influenced the ideals that went into the revolutionary documents of the American founding era, nearly a century later. But the Enlightenment was an inconsistent guide. As I said, although Locke is most remembered for his writing on natural rights, he also wrote the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina in 1669, as that colony was getting started, specifically to protect slavery in the new colony. The transport of slaves to the American colonies accelerated in the second half of the 17th century. In 1660, King Charles II had created the Royal African Company to trade in slaves and other African goods. His brother, James II, had managed the company before ascending to the throne. And the Royal African Company was granted a monopoly to transport slaves to the English colonies. And between 1672 and 1713, the company bought 125,000 captives on the African coast. And 25,000 of them died on the journey to the Caribbean and to North America. The Royal African Company's monopoly actually ended in 1689 when William and Mary took the throne. But although the Glorious Revolution is typically seen as a triumph of liberty, ironically, after it, when the monopoly ended, many more English merchants engaged in the slave trade, and the number of slaves transported increased dramatically. Although slave owners routinely took advantage of their captives' differing languages and customs, many enslaved people managed to adapt to their new lives by forming communities among themselves. And many Africans actively resisted, either by openly defying slave owners or by running away. And as had happened elsewhere, runaway slaves formed maroon communities that often successfully resisted recapture. But slaves everywhere resisted their exploitation. They did understand that rebellion would bring massive retaliations from whites, and that trapped, as they were thousands of miles from home in a foreign land, they had very little chance of success. Even so, rebellions occurred frequently. An uprising known as the Stono Rebellion took place in South Carolina in 1739. A literate slave named Jemmy led a large group of slaves in an armed insurrection against the white colonists, killing several before trying to reach safety in Spanish Florida. The whites suppressed the rebellion, and the slaves who weren't killed in battle were executed or were sold into the West Indies. Jemmy and some of the other rebels may have been from the Kingdom of Congo, some historians believe. And this common background may have made it easier for Jemmy to communicate with the others in a region where blacks outnumbered whites. And this may have enabled them to work together, even though slave owners tried to keep slaves from forging these types of communities. In the wake of the Stono Rebellion, South Carolina passed a new slave code in 1740 called An Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Other Slaves in the Province. This law imposed new limits on slaves' behavior, prohibiting them from assembling, growing their own food, traveling freely, and especially from learning to read and write. Nor was all of the worry about enslaved people in the South. In 1741, nearly 30 years after New York's last major slave revolt, New York City authorities believed that they had uncovered another planned rebellion by enslaved Africans, this time with the collaboration of some poor, free, black and white men. Tensions between the property owners and both enslaved people and the poor exploded when the city's wealthier whites began spreading rumors that several suspicious recent fires had really been the early stages of a massive revolt in which slaves and poor free New Yorkers would murder wealthy white families, burn the city, and take over the colony. The Stono Rebellion was a recent and alarming memory, and throughout British America, fears of similar incidents were fresh. Searching for clues and convinced that slaves were the principal danger, alarmed New York authorities violently interrogated almost 200 enslaved people accused of the conspiracy. Then, after a quick series of trials at City Hall, the government executed 17 New Yorkers. 13 black men were publicly burned at the stake, while others, including 4 whites, were hanged. As you can see from this map that was made not that long after of Lower Manhattan, they actually drew in the killing ground where these people were executed. And once again, 6 more people killed themselves to avoid being burned alive. And 70 more enslaved people were sold down to the West Indies. Now, very little evidence exists in the historical record to prove that the elaborate conspiracy theory that the white New Yorkers had imagined had actually had a basis in reality. But the positive, idealistic ideas of the Enlightenment were not without any effect. And in fact, they even prompted the founding of a brand new colony. Having witnessed the terrible conditions of debtors' prisons and poverty on the streets of London, James Oglethorpe, a former soldier and a member of Parliament and social reformer, petitioned King George II for a charter to start a new colony. The king understood the potential strategic advantage of a British colony positioned as a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida to its south. So he granted a charter to Oglethorpe and 20 like-minded proprietors in 1732. Oglethorpe personally led the settlement of the colony, which was called Georgia in honor of the king. In 1733, he and 113 immigrants arrived, and over the next decade, Parliament funded the migration of 2,500 more settlers, making Georgia the only government-funded colonial project in American history. And Oglethorpe's vision for Georgia followed the ideals of the Enlightenment. He saw the colony as a place for England's worthy poor, so that they could start fresh and make something out of themselves by hard work. To encourage industry, he gave each male immigrant 50 acres of land, tools, and a year's worth of supplies. In Savannah, the Oglethorpe plan provided for a utopia that he hoped would be, in his words, an agrarian model of sustenance, while sustaining egalitarian values, holding all men as equal. Oglethorpe's vision of a just society ruled out alcohol and slavery. It was well known that the existence of enslaved people in a society made work seem degrading. This had been demonstrated in the Caribbean. And the point of the Georgia colony was to give the poor a chance to redeem themselves by work. Unfortunately, The settlers who migrated into Georgia from South Carolina disregarded these prohibitions. Despite its founders' early vision of a colony guided by Enlightenment ideals and free of slavery, by the 1750s, Georgia would be shipping rice and other products into the Atlantic commercial market that had been grown and harvested by enslaved people. So the British colonies grew throughout the end of the 17th and through the first half of the 18th century, during a time when much of North America, especially the Northeast, was engaged in frequent, almost constant warfare. Generations of colonial families knew battle firsthand. In the 18th century, fighting was seasonal. Armies would mobilize in the spring, fight in the summer, and retire to winter quarters in the fall. The British Army imposed harsh discipline on its soldiers, who were nearly all recruited from the lower classes, from the poor, to ensure that they didn't step out of line during engagements. Literally, that they didn't step out of line. If they broke formation, their officers would kill them. On the battlefield, armies were dressed in bright uniforms to advertise their supposed lack of fear. They stood in tight formation and exchanged volleys of close-range musket fire with enemy troops. In reality, British soldiers often feared their officers more than they feared the enemy. And most imperial conflicts during this period had both American and European fronts that they were fought on, leaving history with two or sometimes even more names for each war. For instance, King William's War from 1688 to 1697 is also known as the War of the League of Augsburg. In America, most of the fighting in this conflict took place between New England and New France. Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713 is also known as the War of Spanish Succession. In this case, England fought both Spain and France over who would inherit the Spanish throne after the last Habsburg ruler died. In North America, the fighting took place in Florida, New England, and New France. In Canada, the French prevailed overall, but they lost Acadia, the name of which was changed to Nova Scotia, and they lost Newfoundland to England. The English failed to take Quebec, which would have given them control over all of Canada. Queen Anne's War is maybe best known in America for the French and Indian raid against Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704. A small French force combined with a native group made up of Catholic Mohawks and Pocumtucks attacked the frontier village of Deerfield, killing scores of people and taking 112 prisoners. Among the captives was the 7-year-old daughter of Deerfield's minister, John Williams, named Eunice. Eunice lived with the Mohawks for years as her family tried to ransom her. And during that time, Eunice became assimilated into the tribe. To the horror of Puritan leaders, when she grew up, Eunice married a Mohawk man, had 3 children with him, converted to Catholicism, and refused to return to New England. The idea that English people might prefer native society or might relate to Indians as individuals rather than as just an enemy group was very challenging to English authorities, who continued to publish captivity and redemption narratives to discourage defections. Finally, control of Georgia and trade with the interior was the focus of the War of Jenkins' Ear from 1739 to 1742. This was a conflict between Britain and Spain over claims to the land occupied by that fledgling Georgia colony between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. It partly overlapped King George's War from 1744 to 1748, known in Europe as the War of Austrian Succession, and King George's War was fought in the northern colonies and in New France. In 1745, the British took the massive French fortress at Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. However, 3 years later, under the terms of the treaty that ended that war, Britain relinquished control of the fortress back to the French. But the French would only hold it for about another 10 years. However, that's a story for next time. This is all for now, so I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.